"Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day?" whispered the orphan at the fence. Have you ever heard a question so quiet it stopped your heart? "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day?" That's what a little girl whispered to a stranger at the edge of a dying forest. No name, no home. Just a tattered dress and eyes that had seen too much for someone so small. She wasn't begging for food. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking to belong, even if only for a single day. This is the story of Samuel Wyatt, a man who had lost everything, and of Margaret, a child who had nothing left to lose. Together, they weren't supposed to be anything. And yet, what started as a moment of pretending unraveled into something no one expected. A fight for love, justice, and the right to be chosen. But not every town wants love to win. Stay with us, because what begins at a fence just might change a lifetime. Comment below which part of this story touched you the most. And if this kind of storytelling moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. Now then, let's begin. It was the kind of evening that made the sky blush, muted gold melting into lavender, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. On the edge of a quiet forest, in a cabin that hadn't heard laughter in years, lived a man who had stopped counting time. Samuel Wyatt didn't expect visitors, but that day one came. She didn't arrive on horseback or in a wagon. Just her, dusty shoes, tangled hair, hands gripping the edge of a splintered fence like it might disappear if she let go. And then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, she asked, "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy, just for one day?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't care, but because something cracked inside him, something long sealed. That question, simple and strange, settled into his chest like an echo. And from the dust hadn't yet settled when Sam Wyatt first saw her. Just a slight figure by the fence outside Dry Hollow's general store, arms folded, chin barely above the wood slats. Her coat hung off her like it belonged to someone braver, someone gone. The bundle at her feet was no bigger than a loaf of bread, tied with twine and wearing the same tiredness as her eyes. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped. Sam had mastered invisibility, the type that comes after burying your heart and forgetting where. But something about the stillness in her stance made his steps falter. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even hoping. She was just there. When she finally looked up, her voice came out like something remembered rather than spoken. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy, just for one day?" He should have said no. Every part of him wanted to walk on. But grief recognizes grief, and the kind of emptiness she carried wasn't the kind that passed with sleep. So he asked her name. "Margaret," she said, the word barely brushing past her lips, like it had been forgotten by others too many times before. He nodded, not to her but to some quiet part of himself. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you warm." They rode in silence. She sat upright beside him on the wagon, careful not to touch anything she didn't need. Like space, too, had to be earned. Her fingers stayed clasped, not fidgeting, not reaching. Sam kept his eyes on the road, but he saw her anyway, in the way someone sees what they used to be. At the cabin, she didn't wait to be told. She found a corner near the hearth, laid out her bundle, and quietly made herself a bed with the precision of someone used to being invisible. Sam watched her line her shoes against the wall and pull the threadbare blanket to her chin, eyes fixed on the fire like it might decide whether she stayed or disappeared. He lit another log, not for the cold but because the quiet had teeth tonight. Supper was quiet: 2 canned beans, hard bread, a rusted tin cup of water. Margaret murmured thank you before the first bite, like gratitude was a habit rather than a feeling. She didn't ask where he'd come from, and he didn't ask what she'd run from. But somewhere between the scrape of spoons and the pop of firewood, the silence started to feel like something shared, not avoided. When the dishes were cleared and the fire dimmed, he watched her sleep. Her small frame curled tightly, like she didn't trust the ground beneath her. Sam leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, staring past the dark tree line. Just one day, he murmured, but he knew. Somewhere between that question at the fence and this moment in the firelight, something had already changed. They weren't pretending anymore. Not really. The night crept in slow, like it was holding its breath. Outside, the wind brushed through the pine trees, soft and uncertain. Like it, too, didn't want to wake the girl sleeping near the hearth. Sam sat in his old chair by the window, a mug of coffee long gone cold in his hands. He wasn't watching her, not directly, but he listened to her breathing, slow, uneven, like someone not used to rest. He thought of Clara then, the way she'd hum to herself when the room got too quiet, how she used to talk about children in a future that never arrived. He remembered the cradle they never used, still in the barn, covered in dust and time. A log cracked in the fire, startling him. Margaret stirred, murmured something in sleep. He stood, moved closer. For a long moment he just looked. There was a bruise just beneath her jaw, almost faded now. And her hands, tiny, calloused, twitched like they were still holding onto something or maybe letting go. He placed an old quilt over her, careful not to wake her. The fabric was worn thin in places, stitched by Clara's hands long ago. It still smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. As he tucked the edges around the girl, something inside his chest shifted. Not sudden, not sharp, just a loosening. When morning came, light spilled across the floor in golden slants. Margaret was already awake, sitting on the porch step, her knees pulled to her chest. Sam watched from the kitchen. She didn't look back, didn't speak. After a while he joined her, handed her a cup of warm milk. She took it with both hands, nodded a quiet thanks. For several minutes neither of them said a word, just watched the sun lift the frost from the fields. Finally she spoke. "You don't have to keep pretending," she said. "I know this was just for one day." Sam didn't answer right away. Instead, he sipped his coffee, let the warmth settle. Then the morning air was brittle, like it could break if someone spoke too loud. Sam watched as Margaret carefully folded her blanket, then placed her shoes side by the door. She did everything with the precision of someone trying not to be noticed. They shared a breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples. No complaints, no requests, just quiet chewing and the occasional clink of spoon against tin. It wasn't until midday, while helping Sam carry wood from the shed, that she spoke. "Do you know a man named Josiah Whitlock?" Her voice was flat, as if the name weighed too much to carry alone. Sam's hands paused on the log he was splitting. The name was familiar. A man with too much money and too many secrets. Lived out near the river bend in a big white house with no children but plenty of visitors. Why? He says he owns me, Margaret said. He bought papers from the lady who ran the home. Sam stared at her, not because he didn't believe her, but because he did. She picked at the hem of her sleeve, eyes downcast. He says I owe him work, that I'm too old for adoption but still useful. Sam clenched his jaw. The axe dropped with a dull thud into the log. That ain't right. No, she agreed, but nobody listens. When they come for kids, they don't come loud, they just take, and the rest they stay quiet. There it was, that ache again, that sharp twist in Sam's gut, the knowing he'd seen it before. Young ones disappearing from the orphanage down south, a wagon pulling out at dusk with more shadows than morning. They said my friend Callie went to a farm, Margaret added, but I found her hair ribboned behind the smokehouse. She wouldn't have left that behind. The silence between them stretched, brittle and breaking. Sam felt it in his bones, something unspoken crawling into the daylight. This wasn't just about one girl. This was about all the ones who didn't come back. That evening, he checked the locks twice. He bolted the barn and kept the fire going longer than usual. Margaret didn't ask why. But as she sat by the hearth, tracing the rim of her tin cup, she whispered almost to herself, "It's always quiet just before they come." Sam stood by the window, staring out into the black tree line, heart pounding like boots on frozen ground. He realized something then, something that settled in his chest heavier than any grief he'd known. If he said nothing, she'd disappear, just like the rest, and that he couldn't live with, not again, not this time. That night sleep came slow. Sam sat in the dark longer than he needed to, listening to the fire's last breaths and the wind pressing its fingers along the walls of the cabin. Outside, the woods were still, but in his head the silence moved, crawling, whispering, taking shape. He'd lived long enough to know that evil didn't always ride in with guns drawn. Sometimes it came dressed in fine coats and forged signatures. Sometimes it came with a quiet knock. He couldn't stop thinking about Callie. He'd never met her, but the way Margaret said her name made her real, more real than the men who claimed ownership. She hadn't just disappeared. She'd been erased. And that was the kind of loss no one mourned aloud. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it wasn't allowed to matter. At dawn, Sam took Margaret into town. She didn't ask questions, just followed him, hands tucked into her coat sleeves, eyes scanning the world like it might vanish again. They stopped at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Quaid was sipping coffee, boots on the desk, half asleep in a sunbeam. "I need to talk," Sam said. Quaid looked up, blinking. "About what?" "Josiah Whitlock." That name changed the air. Quaid sat up, took his boots off the desk. "What about him?" "He's buying children, through papers. Margaret here, he says he owns her." Quaid glanced at the girl, then back at Sam. "You sure?" Sam didn't answer, he just stared. Long enough for Quaid to feel the weight of it. The sheriff sighed. "Look, I've heard rumors, but there's no proof. The home signed the release. He pays the fees. Legally speaking, it holds up." "Legally ain't the same as right," Sam said. "And if she disappears, you'll be burying a body you never found." Quaid rubbed his jaw, looked out the window. You gonna keep her? She's already here. They left without another word. Margaret didn't speak until they reached the wagon. You think he'll stop? Sam helped her up onto the seat. No, he said, but now he knows we're not quiet. Later that week the letter came. Folded crisp, sealed in red wax. Delivered by a man on a black horse who didn't stay long enough for a name. Sam opened it with calloused fingers, eyes scanning the elegant handwriting. You have something that belongs to me. I expect her returned by Sunday. No noise, no trouble. We both know what happens when silence is broken. J.W. Sam read it twice. Then he folded it again, tucked it into the wood stove, and lit a match. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, as the flames swallowed the page. Margaret stood beside him. She didn't ask what the letter said. She only whispered, "I'm tired of cages." He looked down at her. The next Sunday, the town square buzzed with the usual hush-hush of a place too small for secrets. Church had just ended. Folks stood in little clusters, shaking hands, sharing weather. But all of it quieted when Sam Wyatt stepped onto the chapel steps, Margaret standing just behind him, eyes down, fists curled into the sleeves of her faded coat. He cleared his throat, louder than the man was used to. "I've got something to say." Every head turned. Even Reverend Clay, halfway through folding his sermon notes, paused. "This girl," Sam said, resting a hand on Margaret's shoulder, "ain't anyone's property. She's not a worker, not a stray, and sure as hell not for sale. She's mine now. And anyone who's got a problem with that can take it up with me." A silence followed. Not cold, not judging, just stunned. As if something sacred had just happened and no one wanted to break it too fast. Margaret didn't say anything, but her shoulders shifted, just enough to breathe, just enough to believe. On the ride home, she held the edge of his coat, not tightly, just enough to know it was there. She didn't ask what came next, but Sam showed her. That afternoon, he took down the shutters in the kitchen. The ones Clara had painted yellow years ago but never hung. They cleaned the sills together, her hands smaller but just as firm. He let her pick the color of the curtain fabric. She chose blue, said it reminded her of sky after storm. They planted a small clay pot with seeds she'd found in the barn. It sat on the windowsill beside the bread box, soaking up light. Every morning after that, she checked it before anything else. At dinner, she started setting 2 plates without waiting for him. By the end of the week, she'd carved her name, just her first, into the underside of the wooden porch rail. One evening, as they watched the fire, she looked up and said, "It doesn't feel like pretending anymore." Sam didn't answer right away. He just smiled, not the kind people see, the kind you feel in your bones. Because deep down they both knew. She wasn't passing through. She'd come home. That night something changed in the way the cabin held its breath. It was subtle. Like the creak of floorboards now sounded less like an intrusion and more like a greeting. The wind tapping the windows didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like someone asking to come in. Margaret moved through the house differently. She no longer stepped around furniture like it might belong to someone else. She leaned on counters, hummed to herself while drying dishes. Once, she even laughed, startled by a moth that landed on her nose, and Sam caught himself smiling so suddenly it hurt. In the barn, Sam found Clara's old rocking chair, the one he hadn't touched since the funeral. He dusted it off, brought it inside, and placed it near the hearth. When Margaret saw it, she didn't ask whose it was. She just sat in it, knees tucked, arms wrapped around a patchwork pillow, and rocked slow, as if she already knew its rhythm. A few days later, Reverend Clay stopped by with a sack of apples and a hesitant smile. "Heard you gave the town something worth watching," the Reverend said, handing over the bag, "and maybe worth believing in." Sam didn't say much, just nodded and took the fruit. But Margaret stood beside him, holding his sleeve, and for the first time she wasn't hiding behind him. She was standing with him. Later that evening she found a nail and hammered a crooked little horseshoe above the door. "For luck?" Sam asked. "For staying," she replied. And when he tucked her in that night, no longer in the corner but in a room they had cleared out together, she looked up and asked, "If I stay forever, will that be okay?" Sam reached down, smoothed her hair, and said, "It already is." Then he turned off the lamp, and for the first time in years he slept through the night. It began the way most storms do in Dry Hollow, not with thunder, but with dust. A faint smudge rising on the horizon, slow and deliberate. Sam saw it from the barn loft while fixing the roof tiles Margaret had painted sky blue just days before. He stopped mid-hammer, eyes narrowing. Dust like that didn't rise without boots behind it. "They're coming," he muttered. Down below, Margaret had been gathering wildflowers along the fence, placing them in the old mason jars lining the windowsill. Her fingers paused. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. By late afternoon, the cloud became shapes. 3 riders flanked by the hush of something unspoken. Josiah Whitlock rode at the center, black coat, silver buttons, and a stare that could chill fire. On his left was Silas, tall and grim with a scar slicing through his upper lip. On the right, a younger man named Lyle, all sneer and impatience, still wet behind the ears but eager to prove something to someone. They didn't stop at the edge of the yard. They kept coming until the horses' hooves kicked up gravel near the porch. Sam stepped out with Margaret behind him. She clutched his sleeve, not tightly, but steady, like a flag holding in the wind. Josiah dismounted with exaggerated grace, brushing dust from his cuffs like the earth owed him better. He gave the house a once-over before speaking. "I believe you're harboring a child under my legal guardianship, Mr. Wyatt." Sam didn't answer. Not at first. His gaze stayed locked on Josiah's until the man finally blinked. "She's not a stray animal, Josiah," Sam said. "You don't get to claim her like a piece of land." Josiah smiled, thin and poisonous. "I have documentation from the state, paid in full. You want to argue morality, go speak with the preacher. I came here for what's mine." Behind him, Silas shifted his weight, hand grazing the butt of his revolver. Lyle cracked his knuckles, hungry for action. By now, the townsfolk had started to gather. Quiet steps, curious eyes. Reverend Clay arrived, Bible still tucked under his arm from morning service. Sheriff Quaid leaned against a post, arms crossed, watching like a man torn between law and conscience. Josiah turned to Quaid. "Sheriff, you going to let this man keep stolen property?" Quaid didn't move. "She's not property." "That's not for you to decide," Josiah hissed. Sam stepped forward, just one step, but it was enough. "You touch her," he said slowly, "and you'll see how thin the line between law and justice really is." The air tensed, the kind of tight that comes before lightning. Margaret's breath was shallow beside him, but she didn't step back. She looked at Josiah, not with fear, but something older, like she'd seen his kind before and wasn't impressed anymore. Then Josiah raised his hand. "Silas." That was the moment. Before Silas could move, Clay Thompson, the blacksmith, stepped forward from the crowd, broad-shouldered and quiet. He held no weapon, just the thick, calloused hands of a man who'd built more than he'd broken. He placed himself squarely between Silas and Margaret. "You want her," Clay said. "You'll have to go through all of us." One by one, others stepped forward. Sarah Holloway, with her schoolhouse shawl and iron backbone. The Baker twins, despite their limp and bad eyesight. Even old Mary Connors, who hadn't spoken to Sam since Clara died, stood at the edge of the porch with a broom gripped tight. It wasn't a fight. It was a line. A line drawn not in blood but in resolve. Margaret stepped into it, not behind but into. She walked past Sam and stood beside Clay. Her hand reached back, found Sam's, and held it like it was a promise. Josiah's face twisted. "This isn't over," he spat. "You're right," Sam replied. "It's just beginning." A shot cracked, not from Sam but from the woods. A warning shot. Sheriff Quaid had drawn his weapon, not pointing it but holding it low and steady. "Best you ride out while you still got daylight," he said to Josiah. "Because this town may be small, but it remembers the right side of history." Silas growled. Lyle muttered something under his breath. But Josiah raised a gloved hand, turned back to his horse. "We'll see what the courts say," he said as he mounted. "Paper always wins in the end." Sam watched them disappear into the horizon. The dust took longer to settle this time. That night, as the town slowly returned to normal, Sam and Margaret sat on the porch. No one spoke of what could have happened. They just listened to the crickets, the wind, the quiet knock of peace returning. The fence Josiah leaned on earlier had snapped under pressure. Margaret looked at it, then at Sam. "We'll build a new one," she said. "Together?" he asked. She nodded. And just like that, it wasn't. The courthouse wasn't a place Sam ever imagined himself standing for something that mattered. It smelled of old ink, musty ledgers, and a kind of silence that didn't come from reverence, but resignation. The kind of silence that hung heavy in buildings meant to speak for those who often didn't get a say. He sat on the left side of the room, back straight, hat in hand, like a man waiting for a verdict on who he'd become. Margaret sat beside him. Her dress was the one Sarah Holloway had hemmed the day before, blue gingham with one button still loose near the collar. Her feet barely reached the floor, but her eyes were steady. Not fearless, but full of something stronger, hope, held together with threadbare courage. The judge, a broad-shouldered woman named Elkins, cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. She didn't smile, but there was warmth in her voice that tried to bridge the gap between bench and pew. "Mr. Samuel Wyatt," she began, "you have filed for guardianship of Miss Margaret, with full intent to adopt, should circumstances allow." Sam nodded once. "Is that your will?" "It is," he said. Margaret turned her gaze toward him, not for confirmation but for comfort. He met it, gave her a small nod. The judge continued, "I've reviewed the documents, interviewed the child, and against more than a few objections from Mr. Whitlock's representatives, I find no cause to deny this petition. Margaret's best interest lies where her heart is already anchored." A soft breath left Margaret's chest. She looked down at her hands, which trembled slightly in her lap. "The state recognizes this guardianship effective immediately," the judge concluded, lifting her gavel. "Miss Margaret, if you're ready, you may sign here." A clerk slid the parchment forward, smooth and precise. The pen lay beside it, long and unfamiliar in her small hand. She picked it up slowly, almost reverently, and for a moment everything in the room paused. She leaned in, pressing the nib to paper, forming each letter like a spell. "Margaret W." The rest she whispered to herself as she signed, like she needed to hear it aloud to believe it. When she finished, she blinked quickly, once, twice, and then did something no one expected. She stood, walked straight to Sam, and wrapped her arms around his middle with the certainty of someone claiming not a man but a place. Sam hesitated. Then his hand came down, slow and steady, resting atop her head like he was anchoring both of them. She didn't cry. She just breathed him in as if memorizing the scent of something she never wanted to lose again. Then she whispered, not loud, not needing to be heard by anyone else, "I want to go home." The words hit Sam deeper than any promise the judge could have made, because home wasn't something she'd ever said before. Not thank you, not can I stay. Just, "I want to go home." And that made it real. Outside, the sun was still high, casting long beams over the street. The world kept moving, carriages passed, children shouted in play. But for Sam and Margaret, the walk to the wagon felt like a crossing. Not towards something new, but back to something they hadn't realized they'd already built. She climbed up herself this time, sat taller than she ever had. When Sam settled beside her, she nudged his shoulder with hers. "We need to repaint the porch," she said. He smiled. "Yeah. It should look like it belongs to someone." Sam didn't answer. He just flicked the reins, guiding them down the road toward the cabin. That night, the official papers sat on the kitchen table, weighed down by a jar of blackberry jam. Neither of them looked at it again. Not because it didn't matter, but because everything it meant was already alive, in laughter shared across soup bowls, in socks left by the fire, in the... It didn't happen all at once, the way people sometimes say healing does. There was no bright sunrise, no sweeping music. Instead, it began in silence, not the heavy, grief-filled silence of a house waiting to be mourned, but the kind that feels like soil softening after the frost. The first crack in that quiet came on a Tuesday late morning, when Sam dropped a mug in the kitchen. It shattered against the wood floor, and before he could bend down, Margaret peeked in, eyes wide. "You okay?" she asked. He grunted, embarrassed. "Just butterfingers." She stepped carefully between the shards, crouched down, and whispered like it was a secret. "I did that once. Dropped a whole bowl of stew. The lady at the home made me eat off the floor." Sam paused, glass still in hand. "You won't ever do that here," he said softly. "Not even if you drop the whole kitchen." That night she laughed while trying to peel potatoes. Laughed so hard at her own terrible technique, She nearly dropped the knife. Sam chuckled too, the sound rough and rusty from disuse. It was the first time in years he didn't mind the noise. After that, life began to layer itself slowly, like winter blankets returned from storage. Margaret began school 2 weeks after the papers were signed. Sam walked her to the edge of town the first day, adjusting the collar of her coat 3 times before letting go. She turned before crossing the street and waved, not shyly, not tentatively, but like she knew she'd be back. At school, she answered to her name, Margaret Wyatt, for the first time. The teacher paused only slightly, eyes flicking up to meet hers, and then moved on like it had always been that way. And maybe, in some quiet place beyond dates and documents, it had. At home, Sam took to baking. Not well, but with enthusiasm. The kitchen turned into a place of scorched pans and laughter. Margaret learned to whistle while stirring batter. She taught him how to crack an egg with one hand, though his first 3 tries ended up in his boots. The fire in the hearth seemed warmer, not hotter but more present, like it knew someone was there to notice it. Books began piling up beside the armchair. Stories about pioneers, horses, places with names that sounded like wind. They took turns reading, Sam mouthing the words carefully, Margaret correcting him when he stumbled. "You read like you're chewing," she teased once. "And you sound like you swallowed the dictionary," he shot back. It became a game, who could find the biggest word that day. The front porch, once a place Sam avoided, became their shared corner of the world. They planted marigolds in mismatched boots, hung wind chimes made from bent silver spoons. On rainy days, they watched storms roll in with mugs of warm cider and feet tangled in quilts. One afternoon, Margaret came home with a drawing from school, a house, slightly crooked, with a sun that took up half the sky. 2 stick figures stood holding hands. "It's us," she said, laying it gently on the table. "I gave you hair." Sam laughed. "That's generous." She shrugged. "I thought you might like to see yourself how I see you." He framed it, placed it above the hearth. Later that week, Sam found Clara's old knitting needles. The wooden box they were kept in smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. He stared at the yarn inside like it might burn him. That night after Margaret had gone to bed, he sat by the fire and began. His hands fumbled, missed loops, cursed under his breath, but he kept going. By the 3rd day he had something scarf-like, lumpy, uneven, ugly as sin. Margaret wore it the next morning without a word, just wrapped it around her neck and headed out like it was woven from gold. Sometimes healing doesn't make announcements. It slips in quietly, through laughter at bad pancakes, through muddy boots left drying by the stove, through small shoulders tucked under a homemade quilt. The cabin, once a place that swallowed echoes, now returned them. It had learned their voices, their rhythm, and as spring neared, light found its way through the curtains, soft, patient light that didn't demand attention but lingered anyway. One evening, as Sam washed dishes and Margaret dried, she paused and said, "I don't think I'm scared of the dark here." He looked up. "Why not?" She shrugged. "Because here the dark feels like something waiting, not something hiding." Sam didn't know what to say. He just reached for another plate and let the water run warm over his fingers. And that night, long after they'd both gone to bed, The wind curled around the cabin walls. The wind had a different kind of chill that night, not the sharp bite of coming frost, but the kind that slides along the spine and makes you feel watched. It was the sort of night where even the fire crackled quieter, like it sensed something was drawing near. Sam had just latched the barn door when he heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, too measured to be lost. From the porch he saw a figure emerging through the fog, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. The way he walked said he knew the land. The way the porch boards didn't creak until the last step said he knew how to move without warning. Sam didn't reach for the rifle behind the door, not because he wasn't cautious, but because he wanted to look him in the eye. He opened the door before the knock came. "Evening," said the man. "Sela's." The same Sela's who once stood behind Josiah Whitlock, eyes like flint, voice like gravel dragged through whiskey. But this Sela's looked older, not in years, but in weight. His coat hung looser, his stance was slower, and in place of that old smirk was something close to humility. "I came alone," Sela's added. "I noticed," Sam said. They stood like that for a long breath, the kind of silence that held too many yesterdays. Then Margaret appeared behind Sam. She didn't gasp, didn't hide. She simply stepped forward, one hand resting lightly on the door frame. It wasn't a gesture of fear, it was a claim. Silas's eyes flicked to her, then back to Sam. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. "Josiah's gone, buried in the kind of silence only cowards earn." Sam nodded once, no grief, no surprise. "Why here?" he asked. Silas looked out past the porch, toward the tree line where the moonlight barely touched. "Because I needed to see what he hated so much. What made him so cruel? I figured it had to be something powerful." Margaret stepped fully into view, her scarf loose from the wind. "It wasn't power," she said. "It was kindness." Silas's shoulders dropped slightly, like those words had landed in a place long sealed shut. "She's right," Sam said. "And kindness don't come with instructions. You either mean it or you mimic it, and you and him, you mimicked." Silas swallowed hard. "I did things I can't undo," he said. "Turned boys into shadows. Helped men like Josiah build cages out of fear." He met Sam's gaze then, clear, unflinching. "I thought maybe, if I passed through the place I last felt human, I might find a way to become him again." Sam studied the man. The boots were the same, the coat, but the posture, there was something slouched now, something that said, "I no longer believe I deserve to be feared." "You ain't getting redemption on my porch," Sam said. "Not tonight." "I didn't come asking," Silas replied. "Just came to leave the part of me that still listens to his voice. Somewhere it might rot." He reached into his coat slowly and pulled out a small envelope. "Her name's not on any list anymore. Not in the county, not in the state. I made sure of it." He placed it on the railing. "I ain't looking for forgiveness," he said. "I just didn't want to die pretending I never saw her face." Margaret stepped closer, now just behind Sam's right shoulder. "You scared me once," she said softly. "I know," Silas whispered. "But tonight," she continued, "you just look tired." Silas looked at her like a man who'd never been seen before, then nodded once. "I hope you both find peace," he said, backing away slowly. And then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. No creak in the porch boards this time. No echo, Sam stood still long after. "You believe him?" Margaret asked. "I believe he's trying," Sam replied. "And that's more than Josiah ever did." She nodded, then slipped her hand into his, grounding them both. Later, inside, Sam placed the envelope in the drawer where he kept letters Clara once wrote, not because he valued it, but because some records are worth keeping, not for what they say, but for what they once threatened. That night the porch lamp stayed on, not out of fear, but because Sam wanted the road ahead of them, however dark, to know they were still here, still standing, still choosing not to run. It was the kind of morning that felt like a pause. Not quite sunrise, not quite day. The light filtered through the kitchen window in long, slanted lines, cutting the dust in half and landing softly across the table where Margaret sat alone, a stub of a pencil in her hand. In front of her lay an old ledger paper, corners curled, one edge torn. On it she was writing something again and again in careful, looping letters: Margaret, then Margaret Wyatt, then just M.W., followed by doodles of stars and trees. Each time she pressed the pencil down, she did so a little firmer, like she could carve the name into the world itself. As if, by writing it often enough, she could prove it was truly hers. Sam watched from the doorway, leaning quietly against the frame. He didn't say a word at first, just watched her small hand gripping that pencil like it might vanish. The way she bit her lip in concentration, how she paused every few lines, squinting slightly like she was making sure it still felt real. After a while he stepped into the room. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. "You mackin' a name tag?" he asked gently. Margaret looked up, half smiling. "Just practicing." Sam pulled out the chair across from her and sat slowly, the way someone does when they're trying to gather the right words before they speak. "You like that name?" he asked, nodding toward the paper. She shrugged, then nodded. "I never had a last name before, not one I could keep anyway." Sam studied her for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small, folded slip of paper. He placed it on the table between them. "What if I told you there might be another name, one that means something more?" Margaret's eyebrows drew together in confusion. She hesitated, then unfolded the paper. One word written in Sam's blocky handwriting: Grace. She stared at it, then looked up. "Why Grace?" Sam's voice was softer than usual, like he didn't want to break the moment. "Because that's what you gave me," he said. "When you showed up at that fence, scared and stubborn and asking me to pretend. You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." He paused, fingers interlaced on the table. "Grace is what makes a man forgive. It's what pulls people back when they've gone too far. It's what saved me from disappearing inside my own silence." Margaret swallowed hard, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes didn't leave the paper. "But Margaret's my name," she said, voice small. "It's what people call me." Sam nodded slowly. "It is. And you can keep it. But sometimes we get to choose again. Not because the old name was wrong, but because the new one feels like who we've become." He leaned forward, voice barely more than a whisper now. "When I look at you, I don't just see a girl who needed saving. I see someone who saves others, with a glance, with a question, with a laugh. That's Grace." Margaret blinked, trying to hold something in. But it spilled anyway, a single tear tracing down her cheek, then another. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that if no one knew me, they couldn't leave me, that being nobody was safer." She met his eyes. "But now, I think being seen might be worth it, even if it hurts." Sam didn't move. He didn't reach across the table or speak. He just stayed there steady like a tree in winter, bare but unshaken. Margaret reached for the pencil again. Below the loops of her old name, it started not with a plan but with a feeling. Late one evening, long after the dishes were done and the cabin had gone still, Margaret stood at the windowsill, eyes on the dark woods beyond the fence. "Do you think there are others, like me?" Her voice wasn't scared, it wasn't even sad, just curious, the kind of curiosity that came from a wound healing slow. Sam, seated by the fire, paused mid-whittle. He didn't need to ask what she meant. Of course there were. Children without names, without voices loud enough to be heard. Kids who whispered to fences in the dark, hoping someone, anyone, might answer. "There are," he said simply. Margaret nodded. "Then maybe we should build something for them." That night she took out her old sketchbook, the one where she used to draw fences, and this time she drew doors, windows, hands reaching out, not in. The next morning they cleaned out the barn. It wasn't much, a sagging roof, hay scattered like memory, but it was a start. Margaret swept while Sam patched holes. She painted the window frames soft blue. He reinforced the rafters with timber donated by the townsfolk. Word spread without intention. One day a loaf of bread appeared on the steps, then a sack of grain, then boots in small sizes, left neatly wrapped in brown paper. Reverend Clay offered to help. Sheriff Quaid brought tools. Even Selah's, months later, sent a letter with a handful of silver coins and a note, "For the ones waiting." And then one early autumn morning a child arrived. He came on foot, barefoot, clothes torn, eyes guarded. Margaret met him at the edge of the clearing. She didn't ask where he came from. She only asked his name. When he didn't answer, she said, "That's all right. We'll hold a space for it until you're ready." She reached out her hand. He took it. From that moment, Grace Haven was no longer an idea. It was real. They built slowly, a cot at a time, blankets stitched from old dresses, a cupboard stocked with chipped cups, each mismatched but cared for. Laughter began to echo through the clearing, hesitant at first, then louder. Children came not all at once, but like spring rain, unexpected, gentle, and deeply needed. Some came alone, some with siblings, some didn't speak for weeks. But they stayed, because something about the place told them, you are no one's burden, you are somebody's answer. Sam built a small wooden sign and asked Margaret to carve the words. She wrote, "A place to be chosen." They hung it on the low wooden fence. No gates, no locks. The world didn't need another cage, it needed a threshold. And so Grace Haven grew, not as a sanctuary but as a declaration. A place built not on charity, but on the fierce belief that being wanted was a birthright. One evening, as the children played under the lanterns, barefoot in the tall grass, chasing fireflies, Sam sat beside Margaret, now nearly a young woman. Her shoulders straighter, her voice stronger. "You did good," he said, eyes on the horizon. "We did better," she replied. Then, after a pause, "I used to think being chosen was about luck, but maybe it's also about choosing back." Sam smiled. "That's the kind of lesson no school ever taught me." That night, as the children slept in the cabin and barn, wrapped in quilts that smelled of wood smoke and lavender, Sam. The wind that afternoon was quieter than usual, carrying with the scent of late summer, dry hay, sun-warmed wood, and distant thunder that never came. Grace stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, folding the last dish towel from the line. Her movements were slow, not because she was tired, but because she had learned the rhythm of peace. It had been 20 years. 20 years since she first stepped through a fence and called a stranger daddy. Now the stranger was a name etched in stone on the hill behind the garden. Samuel Wyatt, beloved father, builder of haven. Her heart still whispered his name sometimes, not in grief, but in gratitude. He had passed quietly, one winter's morning, holding her hand with a faint smile on his lips, as if he'd seen what came next and was no longer afraid. She missed him, some days more than others. But today she felt his presence more than his absence. It came first as a whisper, not from the wind, not from memory, but from the knock. Faint, hollow, on wood. Grace paused. Her hands froze above a tray of apples, peeled and ready to bake. She didn't rush. She simply turned, stepped outside, and followed the sound with the same instinct that once made her step toward a man in a dusty coat. At the edge of the field where the trees met the fence line stood a girl, tiny frame, mud-streaked dress, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. She wasn't calling out. She wasn't crying. She was just waiting. Waiting the way Grace once did, like hope was something you had to earn by standing still long enough. Their eyes met, and softly, in a voice barely louder than the breeze, the girl asked, "Ma'am, can you pretend to be my mama, just for one night?" Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence hold them both. Let the girl's words settle between them like seeds in good soil. She remembered. Not the facts, not what she wore, or what Sam said exactly, but the feeling. That moment when the world paused just long enough for someone to look at you and see you. Not as trouble, not as weight, but as a person. She walked slowly toward the girl, knelt without hurry, and met her gaze. "You don't have to pretend," she said, voice steady but warm. "You already are." The girl tilted her head. Grace smiled, not wide but soft. "You don't need to prove anything. You're not asking to be taken in. You're asking to be chosen. And I choose you." The girl's lips trembled. Her fingers gripped the rabbit tighter. Grace opened her arms. It wasn't the kind of embrace that movies show. No music, no words. Just a small body leaning forward and collapsing against a heart that knew exactly how to hold this kind of weight. They stayed like that for a while. Then, hand in hand, they walked back toward the cabin. Grace pointed out the garden, once just a patch of earth, now filled with tomatoes, corn, and wildflowers. "That's Elijah," she said, nodding toward a boy on the porch. "He's 10. Says he's not scared of ghosts, but sleeps with the light on." The girl smiled faintly. Inside, the walls were covered in drawings, most of them crooked. Footsteps echoed, light and fast and familiar. A teenager strummed a guitar in the corner. A baby squealed from someone's lap. "This isn't an orphanage," Grace said, almost to herself. "This is a place where people get remembered." She led the girl to a room small, with yellow curtains and a quilt folded neatly on the bed. "No locks," she said. "You can close the door if you want, or leave it open, up to you." The girl nodded, quiet. Later that night, when the moon was high and the house had fallen into the soft hush of rest, Grace stepped outside. The stars were out, scattered like memories across the sky. She walked to the old fence, ran her finger. In the end, it wasn't about pretending. It was about choosing. A man who thought he was finished with life chose to listen. A little girl who had been told she was unwanted chose to believe, just once more. And from that fragile beginning came something stronger than blood, a family built not by duty but by love willingly given. The fence where it started, it's still there, but now it opens both ways. So tell us, what moment in this story shocked you the most? What lesson or feeling will you carry with you? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. And if you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and stir something deeper, please like this video and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. It means more than you know. As you walk away from this tale, may one question follow